Good afternoon, class, and welcome to today's lesson 2 on narrative writing. Thank you all so much for tuning in today. I loved the projects that you all submitted for the grade improvement project. You all got extremely creative, and I am super proud of you all. So this lesson is still going to tie into the skills and the content that we touched on in the last lesson. Now, with lesson 2 of narrative writing, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into how to write narrative writing. What does that actually look like? And we're also going to go over some skills and techniques for you all that you can use later on in your different grade levels when you go to 8th grade, ninth grade. This is going to be the blueprint for you all to begin becoming narrative writers. So our standard that we're going to be touching on today is W73. Now we have broken this down into parts. So we have A through D. So we're going to go through each one because they call for different skills. So W73 is write narratives to develop real or imagined experiences or events using effective technique, descriptive details, and clear event sequences. That means that you're going to write a narrative that is either real or imagined from an experience that you had or an event using effective techniques. That means different tools within your writing, and also descriptive details. Remember, we talked about a lot with sensory imagery in the last lesson, and this is also touching in on that. And clear event sequences means that your paper flows in the order in which events happen. Now let's take a look at W73A. You're going to orient the reader. Orienting the reader means you're going to be placing the reader by establishing a situation and introducing a narrator and or characters. Your narrator is going to be the person who is telling the story. You're going to organize an event sequence that unfolds naturally. That means the flow of your paper is going to follow the sequence of events that would naturally happen. They're going to go in the order in which they happen. So when you orient the reader, you're going to place them in that position. You're going to put the reader in your shoes. You're going to introduce them to what you're talking about. So here you're going to be introducing them to the narrator or different characters within your story. And make sure you organize those events in a sequence that is natural in the way that it would happen if it were real or imagined. Now let's look at 7.3b. Use narrative techniques such as dialogue description, which is a conversation between characters, and pacing to develop experience and events or show the responses of characters to situations. So here is where you're engaging the reader. You're going to engage the characters in dialogue, get them talking to help develop your story, help develop the events that happen within your story. Give the story a little bit of life. Here's where you're going to use that. This is one of those unique styles or those effective techniques from W73 that we're going to be talking about here. So use those characters, use your narrative techniques, your storytelling techniques to draw the reader in and set the story up. Now we have W73C. Use a variety of transitional words, phrases, and clauses to manage the sequence of events. So when you're writing, you're going to use your transition words. First, this happened, then that happened, finally, this happened. So your transitions will be first, then, and finally. So you're going to use those transition words, those phrases, and those clauses to help maintain the sequence of events within your story, to let them know what happened first, what followed, and then what happened at the end. Now we have W73D. Use concrete words and phrases and sensory details. Sensory details should stick out to you. We use a lot of sensory details in the poem that some of you all wrote in the grade improvement project. So you're going to use those words and phrases and your sensory details to convey, to tell, to express experiences and events precisely. Now remember, the main key when writing a story is to draw the reader in, make them interested, make them to where they can read what you're writing and be in your shoes mentally. They may not physically be able to experience what you went through. However, if you use certain details that appeal to those five senses, remember, sight, smell, taste, touch, and sound. If you appeal to those sensory details to express those events, that puts the reader in a better position to understand exactly what you went through and pull them further into the story. Good books always keep you asking questions, make you take the place of the narrator, the person who's telling the story, to draw you in. That's how you keep the reader's attention. So this standard is going to help you do that by adding those details to give your paper a little bit of life. This would be the seasoning if you were cooking in the kitchen. The meat would be the story itself, the plot. But everything that makes it special, that makes it taste good, that makes it feel good, will be those sensory details that you add to kind of enhance what you're talking about. Now we have our last standard. Provide a conclusion that follows from the narrated events or experiences. So this is D, the first one. The other one was C. That is a typo. So this, provide a conclusion, that is standard D. The first one on this slide is standard C. That is a typo. My apologies. So with W73D, the last one, you're going to give a conclusion that follows from the narrated events or experiences. So here, you're going to wrap up your paper. You're going to give us a conclusion, an ending that follows from what you talked about in your story, which would be those experiences and events. So all of these standards have been broken down so that you can effectively write a narrative that tells a story using effective techniques and also sensory details. Now, let's dig a little bit deeper into what narrative writing is. So narrative writing tells a story of something that has happened. You will be asked to write about an imagined or fictional experience or event based on a writing prompt. So narrative writing is simply telling a story of something that has happened. You do this every day in your life and you don't even know it. When you're relaying things to your parents, when they ask you, well, how was school? How did you get that scrape on your knee? What happened to you? I thought you were best friends with that person. What happened between you two? Or if you're spilling the latest gossip in school or in life, or what happened over the weekend at Sky Zone, you're going to be sharing that information in narrative. You're telling a story of something that happened. You're going to include the people that are involved, what happened, what the problem was, and how it was solved, if it was solved. So now that we know what narrative writing is and know that we've done this in our lives at some point, let's look at the parts of a narrative. These are going to be this is your blueprint on how to write a narrative. So we're going to use this as an icy. I know we've all had a slushy or a freeze cup or something of that nature before, so we're going to call this the icy method. Very simple. Each letter stands for how you're going to write your narrative. Each letter stands for a part of a narrative. So you're going to have 5 to 6 paragraphs. Your first paragraph is going to be your I. Introduce the setting and the characters. Your introduction paragraph is going to be your reader's first experience with what you're talking about. So you want to introduce where they are, which is the setting where everything is taking place, and also who is involved. Give us a little background about the characters, maybe include a little dialogue. Remember, your introduction paragraph is going to be the very first impression of your story to the reader. Are they going to want to keep reading after this introduction paragraph? That is completely up to you on how you tailor your story. So your I, introduce the setting and characters. Now your second paragraph, that is going to be your C. Create a problem that characters can solve. Now when we say problem, this could have a connotative meaning. A problem doesn't always necessarily have to be something that's negative. A problem could just be an issue or a task that needs to be completed. So you get to choose what kind of problem that is. Is it a problem, a conflict between characters, or is it a problem with something that just needs to be fixed or solved? You get to choose. So create that problem and also include how the characters can solve it. Well, create a problem that the characters can solve. That's where your conclusion is going to come in. Always, always write your paper with the end in mind. Know where you're going so you know how to write leading up to it. So C, create a problem that characters can solve. Now for your meat of your story. These are going to be the events. So E, the first E is going to stand for events. So you have event 1, 2, and 3. Write about 3 events. The third event is the solution. So in this part of your paper, this is where you're going to really hone in or zone in or focus in on the problem of your story. You're going to write about the events that take place. Build up to that climax. The climax is the highest point of excitement in the story. So everything you're writing up until that point is leading up to your climax. So these events will take place. So your first paragraph, you might introduce the problem and the characters flowing from that second paragraph who are involved. Give a little bit more detail. Then the second event can be your climax, the most exciting part of the story where everything is building up to at that point, or the most intense part of your story. Then your third paragraph is the solution. What do they do to fix that problem? Then we're going to move on to our last E, which is in the story with a strong conclusion. Here is where you're going to wrap up your story, close it out. So when you follow these parts of a narrative, this is going to be your guide. Remember the IC. Introduce the setting and characters, create a problem the characters can solve. Then you have your events and end the story with a strong conclusion. That's it. That is how you write a narrative. This is your blueprint to begin organizing your thoughts. So here you have your blueprint. So now let's look at some narrative writing tips. The first tip, organization is key. You have to make sure that your paper is organized to maintain the integrity behind your events, to make sure that everything that you're putting in your paper naturally flows. So organize your story. Use those transition words that we talked about earlier, such as first, next, then, and finally. You're going to tell the story in the way it would naturally happen, in the order in which it would happen. So you wouldn't put something that happened in the middle at the beginning of your paper. You would leave it in the order that it normally would flow if it were to happen. Second tip, make your character speak. Give it some life. Use dialogue by putting quotation marks around words that your characters say. So for example, with dialogue, we see this in a lot of our stories when we had characters that actually talked, like Naya or Salwa from A Long Walk to Water, Frederick Douglass from his narrative, Covey, Liddy. Every time we had dialogue, you have their words in quotation marks. So here, Mom, can you fix it? I asked. Here is where you're going to give your story the needed details to make it interesting, to give it more life, to give it more content, give it more things to talk about. In the third bullet, your third writing tip, activate the senses. These are the things that we talked about in our grade improvement project. Use those 5 senses to get the reader to understand exactly what it is that you experience by the words that you write. In order to do that, you would describe how things look, how they taste, how they sound, how they smell, and how they feel. Remember, you're going to want to put your reader in the position that you were in when you experienced these events. Make them a part of the story by triggering certain senses within them. If they can imagine exactly what it is that you're talking about, you have a better chance of looping the reader in and having them more engaged within the story. Also, use your best vocabulary words. Don't say big when you can say enormous, or don't say cold when you can say people were shivering. Spruce up your paper with better vocabulary. If you use bigger words or different synonyms for certain words, that triggers different. It has a different connotation with whatever it is that you're saying. So big versus enormous. That makes the reader understand just how big it was. It was enormous. Now they get the full context of what you're talking about. Or if you say that people were shivering, you get a better visual of actually how cold it is because you can imagine people actually shivering, or you can relate to a time when you were cold and shivering from the temperature within the room that you were in. Last, check your convictions. At this point, you're going to be checking your grammar. So that would be your spelling, your punctuation, your capitalization. Check each sentence you wrote and fix those mistakes. It is very easy to have run-on sentences or forget to place a comma or forget to start a new sentence. That's why it is important to go back and reread what you wrote. Also, read it out loud, like we discussed in our last lesson. Reading it out loud and reading it to yourself in your head. Certain things stick out to you in a different way because you're appealing to your own senses. Also, have someone else read it for you. Have a peer read it. Have someone at your home read it. Always have someone proofread your paper as well as yourself. You always want someone who is not biased, who hasn't been exposed to your paper before and doesn't necessarily know what you're writing about because they're looking at it with a fresh eye. So always go back and fix those spelling and punctuation marks. Always go back and check, especially if you're typing on the computer. Word Doc has tools that are set in place to correct those functions, correct those mistakes within your writing. So certain words that are misspelled may have a red squiggly line under it. Use those tools to help improve your papers. Now that we've looked at those tips, now let's look at a writing prompt. Write a narrative essay about a time when you found an amazing discovery. So that could be something that you found when you were out at the park, or something that you found within your house that you thought that you had lost. Or maybe you can do an imagined experience about you going on an adventure and finding an amazing discovery. So now that you have this writing prompt, you have complete creative control to write whatever it is that you want that follows from this writing prompt. Now let's look at how we're going to do this narrative writing assignment, paragraph by paragraph. So your first paragraph, remember, you're going to introduce the setting and characters. Suggest only 1 to 4 characters to begin with. You need to write 3 to 5 sentences to describe the setting and introduce the main characters. You will be the main character in the narrative. The reason why you're going to be the main character in the narrative because you are telling the story. You are the narrator. So remember, in a paragraph is 3 to 5 sentences, so you want to use that to your advantage to include those details to describe the setting. Remember, use those sensory details and also introduce the main characters. So for an example, the light of 1,000 stars reflected off of the water as a warm wind blew through my hair. The salty smell of ocean water filled my lungs. I could feel the water tickle my toes while I walked along the shore with my parents and little brother. We were looking for little crabs on the beach, but we didn't remember to bring a flashlight. I said to my dad, "There's no way we'll find crabs out here tonight." So here, you see that they have included sensory details. The water as a warm wind, the light of 1,000 stars reflected off of the water as a warm wind blew through my hair. So they're describing how the wind felt, how the water looked, the salty smell of ocean water, describing how the water smelled and what it felt like. It was strong, it felt their lungs. They could feel the water tickle their toes. These are those sensory details to get you to understand the setting, to visually see that within your mind. These are the details that you would include in your writing. Describe the setting so that the reader can see what you see by what you wrote. So now that we've introduced the setting characters, let's move on to paragraph 2, creating the problem. You want your story to be interesting, don't you? Well, then your main character must have a problem to solve. You don't want to write a story that goes nowhere. It has no plot. It's just telling events after events after events after events with no real substance, no problem to solve. You want to make it interesting. Make them read something about a conflict. Make it interesting. So the problem in your story has to be important enough to be worth solving. So this is where you're going to make sure you're pulling out those good details in your story writing. You have to get creative. Think outside the box. A good problem makes the reader wonder what will happen next. Remember, I discussed this earlier in this lesson. You want to keep the reader asking questions. What's going to happen next? Well, why did he say that? Why did she do this? Make them keep asking themselves questions because they're going to want to find those answers by reading your story. So for an example, here. We were just about to turn back when my brother shouted, "Look!" We rushed over to him and discovered that he had found a mermaid. "Help," the mermaid said weakly. "Help me find my family." So here, he's created a problem. Remember, it's not necessarily something negative. It's just something that needs to be fixed, something that needs to be solved. Here, the problem is the mermaid can't find her family. So that's the problem that needs to be solved. That's the issue that needs to be solved. She needs to find her family. So here, they've created that problem. So in the next paragraphs, we're going to talk about the events that follow. So your main character will try to solve the problem in these paragraphs. The first 2 times will be a failure. In paragraph 5, things will work out and the problem will be solved. Remember, you want to build up. Keep them on the edge of their seat. Give them those details. Give them just enough that they want to keep reading, but without you giving away the story too quick. So let's look at an example. First, my dad and I picked the mermaid up and dragged her over to the water. We splashed some water on her, and she felt a little better. "My name is Coralie. My sisters and I were swimming by when the waves overtook me. I washed up on a shore here. I was just too weak to crawl back into the water." Next, we looked out into the water for any signs of other mermaids. "Do you see my sisters?" Coralie asked. "We thought we saw one, but it turned out to be a dolphin." "I must go back to my home," Coralie cried. Then my mom asked Coralie, "Is there something we can do that might get your sister's attention?" Coralie thought for a moment, and then she answered, "Singing." My mom sang in her prettiest voice, and suddenly a group of mermaids swam up just a few yards away from us. Now here, we see that it's building up now. They tried an attempt to reach her family or to get their attention, but the first time didn't quite work. They thought that they saw signs of life within the water, but it turned out to be a mermaid. Then when they asked Coralie how they could get their attention, they started singing, and now appears her family. So there we have the solution to the problem. Now let's look at how the story ended. In the last paragraph, which is your ending, is when your main character has solved the problem. The story isn't quite finished yet. You are to write a final paragraph to wrap up all the loose ends and maybe even include a moral or lesson that the character has learned. Now, where have we heard this before? A moral or lesson that the character learned. What do we call that in literature? It's the moral or lesson that the character can learn, that you can learn, that the reader can learn. Theme. That is correct. That is what we call the theme. The theme is the moral or lesson that the author's trying to teach you that you can learn from the story. So sometimes you may want to include that in your storytelling. Moral of the story is. Some people lead it up that way. You get creative. How would you address the theme in your writing? Now, let's look at an example of an ending. Coralie's sister nervously swam closer. "These humans helped me," she told them. One of her sisters removed her necklace and handed it to me. Then they took hold of Coralie and swam away with her. I didn't find any crabs that night, but I found something better. How good it feels to help someone in need. So here in the ending, we've wrapped up the story on how it ends. What took place next? The author decided to add an extra detail about receiving a necklace from one of the mermaids. And then we have our theme that was addressed, or the lesson that the character learned. So from reading this paragraph, what is that moral or that lesson that the character learned? Good job. So that would be how good it feels to help someone in need. It feels good to help someone in need. So that is the lesson that the character learned in this story. So let's do a recap. So our blueprint, our IC, the narratives, parts of a narrative. You're going to introduce the setting of characters. C, create a problem that the characters can solve. Remember, the first E is going to be your events. Write about 3 events, the third being the solution, and E is going to be the end of the story. You're going to end the story with a strong conclusion. Now, with this writing prompt, your parents asked you to rake the leaves in a yard on a beautiful autumn day. You raked a huge pile and then you decided to jump in the pile. Oh no! You've fallen into a sinkhole beneath the leaf pile. Write a narrative about how you escaped from that sinkhole. So this should give you kind of a bit of a vibe from Alice in Wonderland. So think outside of the box, get creative when you're answering this prompt. So remember those tips. Organize your story. Make your characters speak. Activate those senses. Remember, use those sensory details. Use your best vocabulary words. And also check your grammar. So check your spelling, your punctuation, and your capitalization. So check each sentence to fix those small mistakes. So here, I want you to practice. Address this prompt. So I'll read it again. Your parents asked you to rake the leaves in the yard on a beautiful autumn day. You rake up a huge pile and then you decided to jump in the pile. But oh no! You've fallen into a sinkhole beneath the leaf pile. Write a narrative about how you escaped from the sinkhole. So use the IC method that we talked about. Use those sensory details. Use those blueprints when you're writing your narrative. Get creative. Tell your story. Make sure that in your introduction, you're introducing the setting and the characters. Loop your reader in. Make it interesting. Give it excitement. I look forward to seeing you all's writing samples. And again, I am so proud of you all and thank you for tuning in to today's lesson. You can email this assignment to me through Microsoft Teams. That's where I'm going to be checking for your assignments. So if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. But again, I thank you all so much for the school year. We're closing out. Next week is the last week of the school year. I am extremely proud of you all. I cannot say it enough for being able to continue that learning energy that you have throughout this pandemic. You all are awesome. You've been a great group. I really appreciate you all. And again, be safe, stay out of trouble, and I will see you all in the next lesson.